This is a little dashboard of all the possible graphs we can make, and we're going to try to recreate those right here in just a few minutes. All right, Data Rockstars, today we are back with another in our Fun with Data series. Today it is Netflix, one of the coolest services we have access to with our streaming history. So hopefully you're logged into your own account and it's your streaming history. So, don't copy that floppy if you know what a floppy disk is. Don't copy that floppy. We are logging in to request our data from Netflix so that we can stream the titles that we rated or the actual watching of titles and trailers and more. So we're going to pop on over to the Netflix site. Make sure you request this data plenty of time before you need to do it because it takes a lot of time for them to spin up those data clusters. So go to the Netflix Help Center. They talk about the data that they have available. So if you're the account owner, how do you obtain a copy of the data that Netflix holds about you? Go right there. It could take up to 30 days. Mine did not take that long. So request that data. And then there are two pieces of data we're really looking for. They have a whole bunch of stuff about your account. I don't really care. I care about that interaction, that thumbs up or down, the star rating in one file, and the other are streaming history. So once you get there, pop on into Tableau, import those two different files to your account, and this is what we are headed to create. This is a little dashboard of all the possible graphs we can make, and we're going to try to recreate those right here in just a few minutes. So let's start there with the titles watched. We had an example up here of a tree chart, and we can do something like that. So maybe we bring in title onto detail. So we've got to start there. So here, as you can see, the count is on the size. So we can do that manually and bring count onto size and see what happens. And now we've got it closer to a tree chart. There is on the show me, it can bring it all the way to a tree map right here, and it'll have that set up. So now we've got the count as what has the number of streams. So you can see, I guess there's an episode of Chef's Table Volume 1 that I've watched 11 times. So let's go ahead and name this Titles Watched. Let's make it by year. So we do have the start time. So let's drop in year, and now we've got it broken up into chunks, but it still looks a little bit funky like that. So maybe we bring year into color as well. And now it's just kind of simple. This is the Tableau default. So in the marks tab, you can find that color button, click edit colors, and choose a completely different color scheme. Maybe do something a little bit different. But now if you have an interactive one and you're publishing it somewhere, you can actually see a fun way to sort of explore by the year what it is. And if you hide the show me tab, you can see the years on the graph. One thing to note in here is that there's actually a filter set. So if you'll notice that up there, I dropped in supplemental video type and it has it set to null. So if you can edit that and click what that is. So that actually just means a normal stream of a video in the Netflix data. They have other videos like hooks that are playing in the app. There's the promotional things, a recap, a teaser trailer, or a trailer. So in this case, I just want to look at the actual streams. But next up, let's look at trailers. So up here, we can actually bring that supplemental video type, and we're just going to drop it in there and only click the trailer. So now we've got trailers up here. So let's see if we can bring in title up here on rows. We're going to add all those members. So now we've got a list of that. So I kind of want to see over time what I'm watching. So let's bring in that start time. That's bringing the year. But I want to bring in exacts there as well. So we've got title there. We've got it there. I kind of want to make this a circle chart so I can see that. Those circles are pretty small. Here we've got title, but I actually want to put it closer to where the action is, closer to where the data point is. I want to put it here so I can separate those titles out and not have them all squished into one line. So I'm going to control click on a PC and drag and drop it to label. And I actually can right click on that title area, and you could just hide title because you know what those are. And you can also click on that whole area and click off show header so it's not checked. And so now we have a much simpler graph there. Also start time, that's probably not going to mean anything to anyone. It's kind of unnecessary. I know what those are. Those are dates. That's great. X that out. So double clicking on that axis below and you can edit whatever it says there to either nothing or something a little more user friendly. I normally don't like more than 3 or 4 colors per graph because it's a lot for a brain to process. You could make them different colors with the type of device you were listening to. So maybe that's one way you want to do it. Let's watch trailers by device. That is what it looks like. So another thing we can graph to see what we've been watching on Netflix. But now we have TV, Google devices, Amazon devices, and other. Let's try to recreate that here. And in the sheet tab, I'm going to type stream by device type, and it won't let you do the same exact title in Tableau for the tab. So I'm going to just put 2. You should do something named a little bit better than that, but it does pull it up here into the title. So if you double click, I always like to keep that sheet name there because it'll pull it right from that tab. And as you duplicate them and make them more, it'll just automatically have that there, and you can add on with extra subtitle there, or you could say, where do I stream? You can always use the formatting here, change up the font. There's all sorts of options. Give it a shot, try something different, and apply. So now we're looking at device types. I'm going to drop that into a row, see what we've got there, and you can always change the formatting and size of everything in Tableau, as well as use this drop down right here. So now we have those devices, and in Tableau, when there's a count of the rows, you have this sheet 1 count there. So sometimes you're looking at actual data, and that's sort of a generated piece of information that counts how many rows have that. So it's not always perfect for when you're summing up, but it works perfect for us today. And so you can drag and drop that on right there to the ABC area. You could sort it here up on the button in the area as well. And remember, device type, we know what those are. I already set in the title, so you can hide that field, labels for row. But now we've got this list of user-friendly devices. I don't like it, so again, I can control click these different items and try to group them together. So I've got them both control clicked, and I'm going to click group with the little paper clip, and now we've got this new thing here. I already had one because we did it in another graph. So you have device type group 1. You can click edit group, and now you can group things together. It combines all the names together in one. So that's not really user-friendly. We're going to call that TV. And there's this neat little feature too, that if they're not grouped, you can do other. And now we've got our group updated. So we're just going to rename it like that. Now we have it set up like this. So we could do show me, we could do a pie chart, drop down here, click fit entire view. Now we have an empty pie chart. So let's fix that a little bit really quickly. So you can control click again on your PC, drop that count to label, and we can do that same thing with device group. And now we've got it both on there. We can make that font a heck of a lot bigger, make it bold, and you can even make it match that mark color to make the user do almost no information. You can just click right there, and let's change that color set again. I always like to drop the opacity a little bit and maybe out of order. I don't know, maybe that's overkill, but we have a graph that makes a little bit more sense now. You can even right click on that, duplicate it, maybe make that a bar chart, making the color like that. You can also add labels. Let's change the font to bold. You could make that match the mark color. You can even format those, change the font, make that bigger, and whatever color and bold you want. And you can even change the background there as well, and the shading if you want. Though you'd probably change the typeface to be a different color. So with that label, you can actually go in the middle, and you can even go to the left. So that's another option. So I'm gonna keep that. I say in the middle looks pretty good for that, but it's up to you, your call, and maybe get some feedback from users there. As you're clicking through a presentation, it's great to have a lot of different versions, so that way you can walk the viewer through it, just an overview, and then dial it down. So maybe we actually drop that device type back in here, and you can see a overview of everything. We can double click there. That's a useless axes, so that's a little bit strong, but you go with that, and now you can see the actual devices, and actually make sure to sort it, and now that makes a little bit more sense. Here is the full setup, how we have it with all of the details. So maybe you have that in the overview, and then you dial that down to see the specifics. But we've got another piece of data that Netflix provided us, was this content interactions data. Let's see how we can recreate this star ratings by title that some user rated. We're going to do that new sheet with this content interactions data, and we're going to bring the month in from the event date. So we're going to drop event date up there. It defaults to year. We're going to click month. Now we also want to have the star value as what's plotted here. So we're going to drop that on. And so now we have this information. So don't forget that we want to think through the data we want to display. This actually shows you the sum of the star values for that month. So that doesn't make sense. It's always really important to think about what you're adding up or what you're averaging together, whether that's all of the ratings for a month. Would you add those up together? That doesn't really make sense. Or would you average them and then you know how good of the streams that you saw that month were? So that could answer one question. But in this question, or in this section, what I'm trying to answer is what actual titles got at a certain time and then plot that over time. What we're going to do is actually bring that title name into the detail. So now instead of just having one dot per each month, you can see there are multiple across that. We can also make this quite a bit bigger so we can zoom in as well. We've got some null values. You can filter those out. I don't need to see what that date is there. And so we have that type of month, but I actually want to do a month and year probably. So let's do month and year and see that over the whole time period as well. This shape doesn't really do it for me. I want that star because we're talking about stars, and now I can see the actual titles and those ratings there. So Firefly, great movie. So maybe we mark that label, always show. And now we can take the thumb value, maybe it has both a star and a thumb, drop it on there, and now you can see the ones that have a low rating. It looks like some weird data there. I don't know how I got a negative star value for Faulty Towers, but probably deserves it, and maybe not 13 going on 30, so that's sad. Okay. All right, so we have noticed we still have a sum there. That needs to be an average. Make sure that makes sense in case there are more than one, and make sure the parentheses are in the right spot in Tableau, and there you go. Now we've got it making more sense up to 5. I do see an extra decimal place there, and who puts that on? That's like totally unnecessary. So you can right click on that, find this scale here, find number custom, and drop off those decimal points until it makes sense. But what we want is one more thing, because this isn't that interesting until we drag and drop title on here. And we can also do the same thing we do with anything else. Make that bold, change the size, do whatever we want there. Star ratings by month and year. There we go. Now, one more thing to do is we did have a dashboard there, and so let's see if we can do another dashboard. There are 3 buttons here at the bottom of Tableau. We have a sheet, a dashboard, and a story. So we want another dashboard. So you can do a few different things here. You've got a drop down here. Right now it's set to fixed size and it's got a really tiny screen. So instead of a fixed size, choose automatic so you can see it better. But it depends on your purpose. If you're at a company and you are building for a specific size of iPad that's going out to 1,000 different salespeople across the country, which I have worked on projects that have done, you actually might want to get it fixed so you know everyone's seeing that exact slice of everything and it's not too cut off. So that would be great. But if it's going to be a lot of different places, you might as well make it kind of this automatic responsive, if you know, like website stuff as well. But we can take these new graphs and you can drag and drop them on here. So it's going to fill in what it can, drop it there. So you can see it'll highlight in gray like the different sections, and it's going to try to sort of auto create what fits, but you can change these, you can make them floating, you drop them in like that. You can also click down here and you can add that title. So that title here, we can say Netflix Dashboard 2. You can also, like you saw in the dashboard as well, you can drag and drop an image section for the dashboard up here, and when you drop the image there, you'll get this pop-up here, so you can choose where it's coming from. You can choose if it'll fit, if it'll center. So let's choose that Netflix logo, and then you can say fit image, center image. You can even link it out to a website or something like that. You can adjust these things, see what works best, and there you go. So we have a dashboard. You can of course format different things. You can right click on that, click format, change all sorts of different things to whatever you'd like and make it look a little bit different. So there is our Netflix data. We've got a dashboard and we are ready to rock. Have fun exploring your data, and we will see you next time. One quick bonus tip too, besides changing the color of the dashboard, we can actually hide all the sheets underneath it. So as we create all those extra graphs, they kind of roll up into a dashboard and you can get it back. Don't worry, you can right click on it again and click unhide all sheets and they'll be back. But it's really nice to just have those all organized into one if that's how you work. And then when you send someone that file, it's just got a few dashboards on there and all those underlying pieces are hidden to the viewer that's checking them out. So another thing we can do, since we're thinking about that kind of publishing, we can go to server and sign into public Tableau. So you can actually get a free Tableau public account and post data like this to that. So we can sign in there. So when I'm back on one of these sheet tabs, we've got an error that we need a data extract. So that's a great reminder that you can right click on that data, click extract data, and click extract. So if you're in some of those situations where you have a giant amount of data, that's a different scenario. This is not a lot of data. This is just someone's personal Netflix data, and we can right click on that other one, make sure you have both data sources extracted so that way it's all in that self-contained file, and once we publish it to the internet, Tableau server can pull all those different streaming titles and is able to do that. So we can actually now click publish workbook, and you can call this Netflix streaming history visualization and click save, and then Tableau will publish it to Tableau public on a website that will be searchable and viewable. And as it comes up there, you will notice that is just the tabs that we have up here. It looks like it is just one. So what you actually need to do is go to the gear tab settings, and up here you can click show sheets or show viz as tabs, and you can choose whether you want to allow others to access or make a copy of this viz so they can download the actual data in there. So otherwise they can just see this level of it, and that's great. So they don't see the actual individual streaming history of the person. But you can also choose to show it on your profile or not. We're gonna go ahead and show it on the profile, but we're gonna hide the ability to download it. Although that's fun to be able to provide it for everybody else in other scenarios, let's just keep this one between us. So there we go. See you next time.